afternoon on this Friday, September 26th. I'm Nina Nofel. These are today's headlines. The Muslim Scholars Committee criticizes the army after raids on Syrian refugee camps in Arsail and calls for investigation into alleged human rights abuses. Prime Minister Tamam Salam is set to address the UN General Assembly and meet with Iranian President Rouhani and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. And the U.S.-led airstrike continues against Islamic State oil refineries in Syria. The Muslim Scholars Committee is condemning what they describe a collective punishment of Syrian refugees in Arsail and say human rights violations took place during military raids on the refugee camps in the border town. A crowd of about 150 refugees gathered after today's Friday prayers in Arsail's main square, protesting against the army crackdown. The army has been conducting several raids in the refugee camps of Arsail over the past few days, searching for militants accused of collaborating with extremist groups during the deadly clashes in early August. The Muslim Scholars Committee is calling for a transparent and impartial investigation of alleged human rights abuses. 2 policemen from the Anti-Drug Bureau have been taken to the hospital in Tripoli after being kidnapped and brutally beaten. The policemen were intercepted by gunmen near Tripoli's Bebe neighborhood around midnight, who abducted the 2 policemen and seized their police car. They were released at 6:30 a.m. this morning and taken to the local Nini hospital, where they were treated for wounds they sustained after being beaten with wooden rods. The police are pursuing the kidnappers. Lebanon has been in a defensive war with jihadists because the country is unable to carry out attacks against them. These are the words of Prime Minister Tamam Salam. He said Lebanon is part of the efforts exerted by the international community to combat terrorism. He is in New York, where he is attending the UN General Assembly session. But the PM stressed that Lebanon's role in the fight against terrorists is rather defensive than offensive for lacking military capabilities. He hailed a UN Security Council resolution demanding the countries take action to stem the flow of foreign jihadists to Iraq and Syria. And he said that he will give a speech at the UN General Assembly at around 10 p.m. Beirut time today, before meeting with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. Kataib leader Amin Gemayel is announcing that the Kataib party will only participate in parliamentary sessions that are dedicated to electing a new president, saying that everything else comes second. He also urged presidential candidates to clear the stage in order to allow new candidates to enter the race. His comments contradicted remarks made earlier by the Lebanese forces that underlined the need to hold legislative sessions to resolve urgent issues such as the salary scale increase. Parliament Secretariat is due to convene next Monday to agree on an agenda for a legislative session, which will probably include the controversial salary scale issue. Lebanese forces leader Samir Jaja is calling on the government to use force to free the security and army personnel held hostage by jihadist militants from Syria and the border area town of Arsail, while discarding the government's approach to the crisis as fruitless. Using Twitter, Jaja said the captives could either be freed by Hezbollah withdrawing from Syria or by a military operation to free them by force. He suggested the government should coordinate any military action to free the abductees with the U.S.-led international coalition against the Islamic State. The U.S.-led alliance has launched new airstrikes against the Islamic State group in Syria. The second day, the coalition is targeting oil facilities. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported renewed strike in the oil-rich eastern province of Deir ez-Zor and northern Hasakeh, both areas targeted by jihadists from the IS, which are planning to extract crude oil for sale on the black market. The British Parliament is debating possible action against the Islamic State, awaiting the vote which will decide whether the UK joins the US-led coalition in carrying out airstrikes in Iraq. British Prime Minister David Cameron said the extremist group is a threat to the streets of Britain and the UK has a duty to confront it. He also insisted striking Iraq would be clearly lawful and warned that the fight would take years and not months. Next, we talk to Paul Donahar. He's the author of the book, The New Middle East. Stay with us. Welcome back. On the line live from Washington, D.C., we have Paul Dunahar. He is the author of the book The New Middle East, The World After the Arab Spring, and was formerly the BBC Middle East Bureau Chief. Today, he is BBC's North American Bureau Chief. Paul, thank you for being with us today. I want to get right to it. In this book, The New Middle East, that you mentioned, you talk a lot about your experience during the Arab Spring, reporting from all these different Arab countries. As it stands today, the biggest news that's making headlines in the area is ISIS. So what do you believe are the borders of ISIS today?
Well, the borders of ISIS are basically removing the borders that used to exist that were created, after the First World War. They are now in the north of Syria. They're now in the north of Iraq. They were slowly expanding. They've been pushed back a bit. I think what we need to recognize was that ISIS, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as it used to be, was on the back foot. It had almost been decimated by the Americans and the awakening in Iraq. Of course, when the vacuum was created in Syria, when the uprising took place and no support was given to what people call the moderate Syrian opposition, and that vacuum was created, Al-Qaeda in Iraq moved into Syria, reconstituted themselves, got money and arms and time to begin to organize again, and gone back into Iraq. So what we're seeing basically is a consequence of inaction by every other player in the region that's just kind of watched this thing slowly fall apart.
You said that this is something that was basically happening because of the vacuum and I guess the West's failure to intervene. Now the Obama administration wants to train and equip the opposition. Do you think this could have been avoided in any way?
Well, I certainly think the vacuum could have been avoided. I think if you look at the Obama administration, people like Hillary Clinton in the first term were saying we need to do something and do something now. They were encouraging Obama a couple of years ago to actually act and start allowing arms and money to flow to the moderates. And he rejected that. It was very much Obama holding off against all the advice of his colleagues.
He built his campaign on peace and diplomatic resolutions to conflict. I think that has a bit to do with it. But you said the vacuum could have been avoided. But say the vacuum was averted, wouldn't there be an ISIS today?
Probably not. I mean, there would be an Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but I don't think they would have been able to have gone into Syria and basically become so powerful that they could basically set up what they call an Islamic State. But what is certainly an entity that's enabled them to place taxes on people, to steal from banks, to run oil refineries and sell that oil across the border through Turkey. So they wouldn't have been able to have created the institutions of a state that allowed them to get richer and richer. What would have happened was there would have been fighting largely by the moderates, obviously with some Salafists fighting as well, but there wouldn't have been this incredible surge by the Al-Qaeda in Iraq that became ISIS if that vacuum hadn't been allowed to be created.
All right. In your chapter on Syria, you write about Hezbollah's involvement in Syria. This is a very hot topic in Lebanon as well, with Islamic insurgency groups holding Lebanese soldiers hostages, demanding that Hezbollah withdraws from the conflict in Syria. What do you think is at stake here for Hezbollah?
Well, Hezbollah was set up as primarily a kind of defensive organization against the occupation of Lebanon and against Israel. What it's done now is change very much its identity. It's gone into Syria. It's presenting itself now as the champions of the Shia. And I think that's kind of complicated for Hezbollah. I know at the beginning of the campaign, they were telling their people, look, we have to go in and protect shrines, we have to go in and protect our community. They weren't trying to sell themselves as supporting Assad, but that's essentially what they've done. So I think Hezbollah's made life much more complicated for themselves. I guess realistically, as the war went on, it was inevitable that they would get dragged in because Iran was so determined to keep Assad going. But this conflict has certainly complicated things for Hezbollah, and I think it's taken it away from what was its primary reason for being, and that was challenging Israel and supporting the Palestinian cause.
Right, that is still part of their plan. You know, in the introduction to your book, you describe a Middle East where there is a stronger Sunni and a weaker Shia, but doesn't the resilience of the Assad regime and the strength of Hezbollah, as well as the continuing influence of Iran, suggest otherwise? I mean, at the UN General Assembly, Rouhani just met with with UK Prime Minister David Cameron, and this hasn't happened since 1979. So aren't the rules of the game changing?
The rules of the game are constantly changing in the Middle East. I think the point is, if you look at where all the fighting is taking place now, you are seeing Sunni extremists that are taking over large chunks of Iraq, that are taking over large chunks of Syria. You're seeing Sunni extremists fighting in Libya. You're seeing them across North Africa. So yes, on the diplomatic front, there have been some changes, and you can argue that Shia Iran is better placed politically. But I don't think it's better placed on the battlefield, because what we're now seeing is a Sunni resurgence. We're seeing extremist Sunnis that are really taking over large chunks of territory.
What about political? All right. What about political influence, though?
Yeah, no doubt they have more political influence. They have more diplomatic clout in terms of talking to the Americans. What we saw at the beginning of the Arab Spring, which I think is the first version of my book that you've got, we certainly saw that there was a change in it. You know, political Islam was becoming much stronger in places like Egypt, and attempts to do that also in Tunisia and in across North Africa. They were basically pushed back by the resurgence of the old dictatorships, the kind of military regimes that you had in Egypt. And so the reality of the Middle East, things constantly change. What we certainly have seen is a resurgence in Sunni extremism. We've seen that all across North Africa. We've seen that in Syria. We've seen that in Iraq. That's the biggest challenge for everybody today. And that's a challenge that Iran can't deal with on its own. So in many ways, we may not be talking about stronger Sunni governments, but we are certainly talking about a much stronger Sunni influence across the region and at the extremist level.
All right. I want to bring it back home. Anne Bernard from the New York Times wrote, and I quote in an article published 2 days ago, Hezbollah and the United States are already working together separately on a common goal to stop ISIS from moving into Lebanon. Mohammed Afif, he's Hezbollah's newly appointed head of public relations, says all have an interest to keep peace in Lebanon. Do you agree? And if so, why?
Well, I think everyone does want to keep peace in Lebanon. I think people in Lebanon generally want to do that. I don't think they allow themselves to be dragged back into another civil war, because the last one is very present in people's minds. So I think Lebanon's always feeling like it's on the verge of war. Before the Arab Spring, whether it was with Israel or somebody else, they always tend to pull themselves back because they know how terrible civil war can be. And I think that's in the interest of everybody. Hezbollah doesn't gain from a civil war in Libya, in Lebanon. Neither does anybody else. You could argue that perhaps some of the extremist Sunni groups would gain from it, but nobody wants to see them taking hold of big chunks of Lebanon. So I think everyone in the international community, will be on board trying to keep Lebanon together. But we have seen some strange bedfellows. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, the beginning of the Syrian revolution, you effectively had elements of Al-Qaeda on the same side as America against Assad. Now we're seeing Assad and Hezbollah on the same side as America, you could argue, against the Sunni extremists. So this thing keeps ebbing and flowing, and until things begin to settle down, we won't really know what it's going to look like.
And it could take a while for them to settle down, as things are constantly changing here. Thank you for being with us. That was Paul Donahar, the author of the book, The New Middle East, A World After the Arab Spring, live from Washington, D.C. He's also today's BBC North America Bureau Chief. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our top stories. The Muslim Scholars Committee criticizes the army after raids on Syrian refugee camps in Azzail, calling for an investigation into alleged human rights abuses. Prime Minister Tamam Salam is set to address the UN General Assembly tonight before he meets with Iranian President Rouhani and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. And the U.S.-led airstrikes continue against Islamic State oil refineries in Syria. Thank you for watching Future Television. This is the English News. Yumna Nofal signing off. Have a great weekend.